Hey, what's going on, everyone? So this is going to be my long form pedal board walkthrough. If you're finding this video here on the second channel and you haven't seen the board build of this rig that I did with XTS in Nashville, click the link up here or down in the description. Go watch that video first, and then come back here and watch this. This is gonna be a long form, just sort of detailed walk through the entire setup here. I'm gonna take you through the general philosophy of this board, why we made the choices that we did, some of the signal flow, the technical stuff. This is gonna be the deep dive nerd episode. So if you're interested in that, buckle up. I will have chapter markers linked down below, so if there's something specific that I talk about that you want to cover, you can just skip ahead to that. And I will have links in the description of this video to the pedals that I'm using, as well as links to XTS. If you watched the main video, you saw what an incredible job those guys did over there. I cannot tell you how awesome it was working with Barry and Eric. So if you're thinking about building a rig or you have questions, reach out to XTS in Nashville, Tennessee. They work with people all over the world. You don't have to be in Nashville. You can send your stuff in, they can build it and send the board back to you. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's jump in, take a look at the board. This is it. It looks amazing. It's pretty complicated. There's a lot going on here. So we'll start with sort of the general like overview and signal flow. Today I'll be playing my Jazzmaster. This is a Ventera 2 made in Mexico. It's completely stock. This just got a good setup on it. And then I'm going into the board, through the board, out straight into the front of my 2-Rock Classic Reverb Signature. And that's going through my aux and being recorded. So the first thing to talk about is sort of the layout of this board and the signal flow. I have two options here. Now, if you look in the top right-hand corner, you can't really see it on the overhead shot, but I'll throw in some B-roll here. This is a bespoke interface, pedal board interface that XTS makes, which is super cool. One of the first things I talked to Barry about was being able to run this board with an effects loop and without an effects loop. I use lots of different amplifiers. Some of them have effects loops, others don't. And I wanted the option to be able to have some of the effects in the loop or be able to go straight into the front without having to change anything on the board. And that's what this box does. All you have to do is plug the send and return cable into the respective inputs here on the interface. It'll do some internal switching with some relays and everything to basically change the position of some of these effects and put them in the loop of the amp, which is super trick. We also have a insert point that we have mapped to the Mastermind PCB6X. So if I wanted to patch in a pedal, some kind of amp in a box, a model or something like that, I can use the extra send and return insert point here on the box, plus it has a 9-volt out, so I can power a 9-volt pedal off of it, and then it'll actually get integrated into the switcher here. So I can have an outboard effect off of the board and have it controlled by the switcher, which is so rad. That XTS box is honestly one of my favorite parts about this board. So other sort of general things, the board itself was built by the guys at XTS. I had a requirement of being able to fit it in my Pelican case, which is a 1615 Air case that I've had for years. And I needed the board to be under 50 pounds in the case so that it will fly. And we got both of those things. The board in the case with a power cable comes in right at 48.5 pounds, which is perfect. So I shouldn't have to worry about any kind of airline overage charges and things like that. There is a tier. So we have the front row of pedals here. We have the top row of pedals here. And then under the tier, a little squeaky, could use some WD-40. We have all the stuff under here that is integrated into the looper. For power, we're using Strymon. We've got the Strymon Zuma and then a pair of Ojai expanders. And then for MIDI, we're using the Strymon MIDI splitter. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I'll put it down here. I actually wasn't familiar with this MIDI distribution box, but this was a selection that Barry and the guys made over there, and I'm glad they did because it works great. For switching, we're using the RJM Mastermind PCB6X. I've had this laying around my studio for a few years, waiting to get used in a rig build. RJM did send this out to me a few years ago, and it was unclear at the time if they were looking for some kind of video or something like that, but it just kind of got put on the back burner. and it's finally getting used. There was some discussion as to whether or not we were going to upgrade to the 10X, but we decided to go with the 6X to keep the smaller form factor. And because we're utilizing MIDI as heavily as we are, I didn't need all of the extra loops, all the I/O that the 10X would have given me. So I was able to fit a couple extra pedals in here, having a smaller switcher, and it's working out great. Now, the main reason I wanted to have this board built was for my original music. I just started releasing my original music. I put out an EP earlier this year called The Early Days, and I've got some more music on the way. And one of my goals for the coming year is to start getting out and playing live. But a priority that I had was being able to get a lot of the sounds that I got on record in a live setting. I spent a ton of time sort of dialing in these guitar sounds on my EP, and I'm really proud of them, but I wanted to be able to replicate them live consistently, no matter what type of rig I was playing and no matter what type of room I was in. So that's the driving sort of idea behind this board, and the reason we went with a MIDI switcher as opposed to just a standard loop switcher or a smaller board. And right now I've got the Mastermind set up in song mode, basically. So this is a set of sounds, set of tones for a song of mine called Aurora, and I've got them split up into the different sections. So to start off with, we've got the intro sound, and then from there we go to the main guitar hook, which is a specific sound. Then from there, there's a bridge sort of solo section that I got a specific kind of fuzz sound on, and then a solo sort of jam section at the end. And you can see, if you look at some of the MIDI pedals here, as I'm switching through, presets are changing. You can see the Chase Bliss, the Preamp Mark II, those faders are moving around, which is so sick. I never get tired of seeing that. It's so rad. And so what this allows me to do is basically have specific sounds that are utilizing certain presets and a certain combination of pedals in a certain order, and then immediately switch to just dry with a fuzz, for example, turning everything else off without having to do all the tap dancing and everything around the board. This is something I had on a board years and years ago when I was touring with an artist named Jesse Wilson, and I was so happy with it. It allows me to do all of the work ahead of time, to do the sort of thinking and planning ahead of time, so that when I'm actually playing music and performing on stage, I don't have to think about any of this. All of this is done. I just hit the buttons to bang through the songs. And there's still room for creativity. I'm not locked into, I'm not locked on rails here. I still have some options to move stuff around, which I'll show you in a minute. But just to give you a quick sound example, so this would be like the intro sound. Now, if you've listened to that song on my EP, I think that sounds pretty close to the original, and there's a lot going on here. But if I go to the next sound, which is the guitar hook, it's like this. Then the next sound would be that bridge sort of fuzz. And then the solo section. So vastly different sounds with a lot of switching going on, a lot of presets changing, and all I'm doing is hitting just one button. That's the general idea. Let's take a look at some of the pedals we've got going on here. Some things that were absolute must-haves for me with this board. First and foremost was the Chroma console. I bought the Chroma console the day it came out, when Hologram announced it last year, about a year ago now, actually. And I have used it on almost everything I've done since, including this EP. It's all over the bass guitar sounds. It's all over the drums. It's over the synth sounds and tons and tons of guitar sounds. So that one was a non-negotiable. The next one was the Mood, which if you watch my channel, you know what I do. The Mood is one of my favorite pedals of all time. And again, like the Chroma console, I use it all the time. But there's something interesting happening here with where it sits in the signal chain, which I'll show you in a bit. Then the Preamp Mark II. This one came off of my studio board, my pre-existing rig. And this one, it does so much stuff. It's an EQ, it's a boost, it's an overdrive, it's a distortion, it's a fuzz. It can even be a wah if you wanted to with an expression pedal. It's super versatile, and being able to have the MIDI switching capabilities and being able to like bank through, it allows you to kind of combine all those pedals, all those jobs into one box, which is super cool. Another non-negotiable under the tier was the beam splitter from Old Blood Noise Endeavors. This is something that I bought after watching Nick from JHS show demo it, and started to work on finishing the songs on the EP the day that it showed up. And again, like the Chroma console, it just ended up all over the record. It does a really unique thing that I really love. Beyond that, the GFI Duophony. Now this is kind of a sleeper pedal. If you don't know about it, I'll have some links below to some really interesting videos, people demoing it. This doesn't make any sound, right? It's not a delay or reverb or anything like that. It's a stereo 2-channel line mixer, which we'll get into what it does here in a little bit. But basically, it has 2 loops. It has an X and a Y loop. I have them both run in mono. And those are sent to 2 different pedals here. The GFI Synesthesia, which is another absolute favorite of mine, and then the Chase Bliss Dark World. This is a relatively new sort of addition to me. I bought this a few months ago when they announced that they were discontinuing. I just went online and bought one. And basically, this Synesthesia, which is a dual modulation pedal, sits in the X loop, and this reverb sits in the Y loop. And with the Duophony, it lets me blend the 2 together. I can put them in parallel. I can put them in series. I can use an onboard LFO to sort of pan between them. I can change the overall levels of them. So for example, this sound right now on bank 1 is just the reverb. This sound on bank 2 with the green circles is the GFI. So you can hear that reverb is coming from the Dark World underneath the tier there. And then see what sound do I have pulled up on the GFI right now. Okay, I got a phaser on, so I'll turn off the HX1. So this is the GFI phaser. But I can do this. This is a touch pad. And if I bring in that blue, I'm now blending in the reverb in parallel with the phaser. So I can go 100% reverb, or just blend in a touch. One complaint I do have about this pedal is that circle is not the most sensitive thing ever. So it's not something you're going to do on the fly necessarily, but. And if I hit the circle down here, this is my dry signal. So right now I've got the dry signal blended in with the reverb and the phaser, but I can take that all the way out. So now it's just 100% reverb and phaser. Now 100% reverb. Super cool. It'll do a lot more than that, but that's just kind of a general overview of what it does. So those were like the must-haves. The next thing was a few sort of effect categories that I needed to have covered. One was a good fuzz option with an octave for an octave fuzz. That's a sound I use all the time. A good delay, was another one. And then sort of a general kind of jack of all trades wildcard pedal that can sort of fill in the gaps, and a good boost. So that's basically what the rest of this stuff is. For the fuzz, I went with the Abelia fuzz from Beatronics. It's a great fuzz. It does some really cool stuff, namely the Tropicalia mode. So if I double tap the foot switch here, it'll switch into this really nasally sort of laser beam like fuzz, which on its own doesn't sound that appealing, but in the context of a right kind of song or the right kind of mix, that really sort of glass laser beam fuzz is a lot of fun to use. And then I've got the Argonaut from Mythos, and I did that instead of using an octave fuzz, because this, I can apply that octave to the fuzz or to one of the distortions or on its own. It gives me the option to put that octave anywhere in the chain. For the distortion, this was a last minute addition. We ended up having space on the board, but I went with the Pack Rat from JHS. The Rat is, I think, one of the more underrated distortion pedals out there, and it's never really been my go-to, but it actually fits really, really well with this board, especially the Pack Rat having the 9 different Rat options on there. And it can actually be surprisingly nice sounding. A good example of that would be like John Scofield, the Agogo record. That's a Rat into an AC30. So not your typical sort of Rat sound. For delay, I went with the RE202 from Boss. And the reason I did that is because I have a real RE201 in the rack up there. You can kind of see it up there. I've had it for a few years. My wife bought that for me a few years ago because she is awesome. And again, it's another tool that I used on the EP a ton. And I wanted to be able to have that consistently on my board without having to take my real 201 out on the road. So the 202 is filling that space. And then for the wild card slot, we're using the HX1 from line 6. And this is there to just fill in the gap. There's a lot of redundancies happening here. For example, with phaser, I have 3 different options. Like the Chroma console will do a great phaser. The GFI Synesthesia will do a great phaser. That's what it's set up as right now. And then the HX1 will do basically any kind of phaser you want. So why do I need 3? Well, the idea was to be able to cover my bases. Maybe I don't want the phaser coming from the Chroma console. Maybe I want a tremolo or the doubler. And maybe I don't want the phaser coming from the GFI Synesthesia because it has its own sort of unique sounds that only it is capable of. So that's where the HX1 comes in. A good example of that is the intro of this song Aurora. I've got Pebble Phaser, which is basically like a small stone here. And that's great because neither the Chroma console or the Synesthesia will do that sort of small stone sound. And if you know anything about the HX effects, which was on my old board, I think the Line 6 effects are phenomenal. And it also has a looper in it. It has some other things in it that nothing else on the board will do. So I think that's about everything. The last thing is the Zio from Source Audio, this boost here on the side. And, oh, that's here. So the Zio is here on the side, and it is in a loop on the switcher, but that loop is permanently on. In the settings, we've locked that loop on so that no matter what is going on here, no matter what setting I'm on here in the song mode, I can always kick that boost on and have it boost either the front end of the amp, or because you can move loops around in the Mastermind, I can boost the front end of the fuzz, or I can boost the front end of the Chroma console or the Preamp Mark II. And it's there to be turned on and off at will as I see fit, which is super, super cool. Now, I'm not just programming my songs. I've actually got a gig coming up that I'm doing with a few friends of mine, one of them named Zach Person. And the way it's going to work basically is we're going to kind of share a bill and share a band. So when I'm playing my set, Zach will be backing me up on rhythm guitar, and vice versa. When he plays his set or his songs, I'll back him up. So I'm actually going through and I'm programming his songs into the set list here on the Mastermind. And it's cool because his sounds are very, very different than mine. I'll have his record linked down below, Zach Person. It's amazing. It was produced by my friend Tyler Bryant. If you like this channel, you like what I do, you'll really like his record. And this is a song of his called Muddy Water. That's a really cool, just like fuzz rock, kind of heavy thing, right up my wheelhouse. And so I'm kind of dialing in some pretty gnarly sounds here that I wouldn't be able to get easily without some of the combinations of effects on this board, and I wouldn't be able to switch through them as easily as I am with the Mastermind. So the song starts off, again, it's called Muddy Water, and we're doubling this big, huge fuzz riff, just... And again, that fuzz sounds kind of like narrow and mid-rangey, and that's on purpose because I'm wanting it to fit with the fuzz sound he's got, which is a little bit brighter and harsher sounding. And for that, I've got the Abelia dialed up. I've rolled some of the top end off here, and I've got it in the, the Nectar setting. And we're just gonna double that. And then over the verses, if you listen to the record, there's this like crazy, gnarly sounding DI fuzz guitar that's doubling the vocal melody. So as he's singing, there's this crazy sounding guitar tucked in underneath his voice, and we want to be able to do that live. And so I programmed this sound, which sounds kind of nuts, but it goes like this. Again, that's a sound that I wouldn't normally go for, but with the rest of the band, where it sits tucked in underneath his vocal, it has a really cool effect. And to do that, I've got some slapback coming from the 202 here. And then I'm combining sort of two different distortion sounds. I've got the preamp Mark II, and then I've got the Synesthesia. So let me just show you what the preamp Mark II is doing. It's that super gated, gnarly, nasally fuzz sound. Whew, nuts. And then combined with that is the Synesthesia, which is doing this sound. Another bit crushed distortion with a little bit of an octave kind of thing in there. So when you have both sounds together, again, it's nuts. And I might make some tweaks here. These are not the final sounds. We still have one more rehearsal to go, so I'll change some stuff around. But yeah, like that's a wild sound that I'm able to get by combining the gated, gnarly silicon fuzz of the preamp with the GFI Synesthesia. And then from there, I have my own sort of solo, which will be something like this. So for that, I'm using the Abelia, and then I've got the Argonaut underneath, adding the octave up. And this is what's cool about the PCB6X is, I don't know if you can see this strip down here, but this shows you what loops are on and what order they're in. And right now I'm using loops 1, 2, and 3. Loop 4 is lit up there because that's where the boost is. It's always engaged. But 1, 2, and 3, where loop 1 is the fuzz, loop 2 is the Argonaut, and loop 3 is the preamp Mark II. But if you look Here on the setting, you can see I've got it set to where loop 2 is actually the first in position, then it's the fuzz, then the preamp Mark II. And that's because I wanted to have the octave up before the fuzz. And that's one of the cool things that you can do with a switcher like this is on a per setting basis, I can completely shift all of the loops around. So when I hit this button, it's not just changing what loops are turning on and turning off and what MIDI is happening, but it's also moving the loops around inside the switcher itself with no real noticeable lag or switch in audio, which is super cool. So I can go from this crazy fuzz sound, which you can see here, the loops are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on. But then when I click this, it engages the Argonaut, engages the fuzz, and flips the loops around, which is so cool. And again, I got the preamp Mark II switched to a setting, but it's bypassed. So again, in the live setting, if I want something more, I can just kick on the preamp Mark II. I've got it set to roll off some of that top end and tame it a little bit and add a little bit more gain and saturation overall. So let's switch over to loop mode here to where now we're no longer in the preset mode. Now each one of these buttons on the switcher corresponds with a specific loop, and that's what these labels are here for. So loop 1 is the fuzz, loop 2 is the Argonaut, the preamp, so on and so forth. And this is cool because in the middle of a song, I could, if we were going to a jam section or something, I could just switch over to loop mode and ditch the presets altogether and then just choose what I'm using like a traditional pedal board. I'm not tied into the switching. So I'm going to show you a couple of the sounds in here that we haven't touched on yet, primarily the beam splitter. This is a sound that I really love using. Let's turn off the delay. So right now we just kind of have a clean sound. So the beam splitter is really cool. This is how I have it set. Now, if you're not familiar with the beam splitter, you should check it out. Old Blood Noise has something really cool on their hands with this pedal. Essentially what it is 3 different distortion pedals in one. You have sort of the purple channel, this green channel, and this blue channel. The green and the blue channels both have kind of a delay on them. And this deviate knob kind of controls the delay between the 2 channels. There's another trick though, which is that each one of these channels have their own individual outputs on the pedal. And this is how I used this when I was recording the sounds for the EP. I'd plug my guitar into it and I'd send the main output, which is just this purple channel, to an amplifier and just use like a distortion pedal. But I would take the green output and the blue output and I would send those direct into my recording interface and I'd hard pan them left and right. And so what you would get is by playing one guitar sound and utilizing the deviate control and the delays between the 2 channels, you get this crazy, wild sounding, triple tracked, distorted, fuzzy thing, which I think is an underrated effect, by the way. Taking a distortion or a fuzz and just recording it DI and getting that super snarly, gross, sort of digital clipping thing can be really cool. Now, we can do that live with this pedal board. Because of where we have the beam splitter on the back row here underneath the tier, I have access to those outputs. So when I want to, I can take a stereo DI and plug it into the green output and the blue output and send those to front of house, where essentially that signal will leave the pedal and leave the pedal board there. It'll just go straight to front of house. And then the main output will continue to go through the board. Right now, the way I have it set up, I'm just using the main output. And when you do that, it sums all three pedals, or all three circuits together, rather. So I'm getting a combination of all three. But I can split those other two, send them to front of house, and get that sort of like stereo triple track DI sound that I got on the record, which is super cool. But this is the way it sounds. And you're kind of balancing the three different distortions together, but this is what the time and decay knob do on each one. See what I mean? You can start to get some really cool kind of sounds there. What other distortion pedal do you know of does that sound? Again, it's not right for everything, but I use it at a few specific times in the set, and it works so well as like if you're playing a single note guitar melody, for example, and you want it to just stand out and grab people's attention, the beam splitter is so good at that, especially if you're using that like stereo DI triple track kind of thing. Another thing I talked about is being able to combine the Argonaut with the other pedals, like the preamp Mark II, for example. So this is the setting I've got on the preamp right now. Can add some dark world here. That's kind of sick. So essentially what's going on there is the Duophony's got that killer distortion sound. I'll show you some of these other sounds that the Duophony has in here that I downloaded these presets from someone I saw on YouTube. I can't remember their name, unfortunately, right now. But I went on their website and purchased their presets and saved a lot of them and tweaked a few. But the Synesthesia is such a slept-on pedal, man. It's so cool. Like, where else are you gonna get that kind of sound, you know? And what's cool about this is because I have it set in the Duophony, it gives me more options. Like that sound, if I just kill my dry signal here, we just have the GFI. Right, it's a little weird. So now I'm combining the Dark World reverb with that sort of tape modulation kind of sound. And I'm doing them in parallel with the Duophony here. And then I can bring my dry signal down so we just have more of the effect. Okay, so the last thing to cover here is the mood. And we're covering it last because it is the last thing in the chain. This is the only pedal on the board that is not in a loop on the switcher or is not controlled by MIDI. The mood is just kind of out in space. It's in its own sort of world, and it's the very last thing in the chain. So anything that is happening on the board is going through the mood, and it's in mono. And I should point out, the entire board is wired in mono. I don't use stereo guitar amps. I certainly don't use them live. I don't really record with them that often. And that ended up making the board more simple. Overall, it was easier to wire, which makes it also a little bit lighter weight. I have half as many cables on the board as I would if I was running in stereo. So yeah, there was just no reason for me to do it. Now, the mood is the last thing on the board because the way that I use the mood is like a little sort of looping, micro looping sketch pad thing. So let me get an example going here. I'm gonna go to the next song called Heavy Bike. This is cool because when you page up to the next song, it shows you the separate presets in the song. So in Heavy Bike, I have an intro, hook, and just the starter sound. So there's really only these two sounds here, but we'll go to this intro, and this is how the song starts. Delays coming from the 202, a little bit of reverb. Let's see what else we got on here. That's basically it. We got the 202 and we've got some chorus coming from the Duophony, this 90s chorus, like tri-chorus kind of sound. And so at any time, no matter what I'm doing, I can hit the mood because it's always listening. This right channel of the mood is always sort of recording and recording over itself with this, and I leave it on the tape setting. So now I've just kind of grabbed that section of what I was just doing, and I kick on the reverb here. And I can start to manipulate this. Get kind of like a really vibey low pad here. Stick the reverb on underneath this. And then I can use a sound like that to build sort of an ambient pad, like what I've got right now. And then because it's last in the chain, I can switch my sounds here and it doesn't affect what's happening on the mood. So now I can go to the hook sound for Heavy Bike and play over this pad. So it's really fun. It allows you to do interesting sort of live performance things. You can kind of create transitions between songs. You can use it to like play over the top of yourself, create a nice bed, a drone kind of sound, and play on top of it and improvise. It really is kind of its own instrument. That's the way I think of the Mood. It's its own sort of instrument. Yeah, that's why we left it independent of the rest of the board, is so that I can kind of work with it on its own, regardless of whatever else is happening. So I'll quickly kind of walk you through a few sounds that I've got set up for different parts of the set. So this is a song called For Penny, and it has this really nice kind of ambient intro on the record. And I wanted the ability to kind of build on that and do something more interesting live. So essentially what we've got going on here is a really cool sound with the hologram, and the boss reverb is bypassed, even though the on switch, you can see the light here is on. That's because of a bug that I've got to fix with this, where it's not turning on and off via MIDI. So the delay is actually off right now. And this intro sound is really just a combination of the hologram and the Duophony doing something interesting with the dark world and the synesthesia. But I will show you just the hologram sound to start off with. This is one of the greatest pedals ever made, man. The Chroma console is it's so good. So that's what it's doing. A little bit of little saturation from the sweeten setting, some vibrato, just giving it some subtle pitch variation. Then the collage setting is that sort of granular, pitched up kind of thing that you're hearing, and then it's all going through a cassette tape kind of sound. So that's really nice. And then this is what the Duophony is doing. And remember, the Duophony is just controlling the dark world reverb and the synesthesia. So this is what that sounds like. So essentially what's happening here is I'm getting this sort of like crushed octave up thing from the synesthesia. I'll turn off the reverb and you can hear just the synesthesia. It's subtle, but it's in there. And then I've got two different reverbs going here on the dark world. I've got a long sort of hall setting. But the real crux of this sound is what's happening here on the D side of the dark world, which is a setting called black, which is kind of like a freeze function. So it's going to take whatever you play into it and just hold it. So when I combine that with the reverb, these are run in parallel, by the way. The reverb and the black setting are in parallel. That becomes just like a bed of whatever chord that you played into it or whatever notes. So then when I put the Chroma console, which is in front of all this, when I turn this on, now I can take this a step further, because remember I've got the mood here, so if I get kind of a nice sound going, now I've sampled just that little section there on the mood. I'm going to slowly bring this up. Now what I can do is switch from my ambient setting here to the next thing. That's sounding a little weird, but that's the thing with the mood, is like sometimes you get, you're never gonna get the same thing twice with this pedal, which is kind of what's cool about it. So now I've got this sort of bed thing happening that I can play over the top of. See, you can start to see how much fun this board is to play. Now, so far I've shown you some pretty interesting kind of out there sounds, but there's some more normal sounds in here as well. Like for instance, the lead setting on 4-penny is basically just the Rat and the preamp Mark II, but I've programmed it so that when I switch to the lead setting, it shuts off the preamp Mark II, so I can use this as a boost here if I want. So. Overdrive sound, right? It doesn't scream like distortion Rat kind of thing at you. And if I want a little more, just kick on the preamp. And one thing that I'm finding is when I'm programming these kind of sounds, even if I'm not using a pedal, is programming it to switch to a setting that I might decide to kick on when I'm using the sound. A good example of that is the HX1. When I go to this lead setting, I had it switch to this vintage digital delay, which I believe is like a TC2290 rack delay. And it's doing this. And I can just switch on the tap tempo. So in the moment, if I wanted to, I could switch to just as an example. And again, remember, I always have this boost available too. Now with an amp that has as much headroom as the 2-Rock does behind me, I have to be careful how I have that set and where it's set in the chain, because I can have a lead sound like that and step on the Zeo boost and just double or triple the output of the amp, because it's a 100-watt amp. It's got the headroom to do that. So that is something that, you know, it depends on the setting. Depends on what kind of amp I'm playing in front of and all that kind of stuff. So this is a song called Feel It. Again, the artist name is Zach Person. I'll have it linked down below. Really cool record, produced by my other friend, Tyler Bryant. Really fun. And his sounds are a little bit more like straight ahead than my sounds. So this is a song of his called Feel It. And I started off by doing this kind of like reverby picking part. And this is basically just the Chroma Console, the 202 and the HX1. And the Chroma Console I'm using to get a little bit of overdrive from, and this compressor. I love the compressor in the Chroma Console. It's super drastic. It is not transparent at all. You really only have one control, which is the amount of compression, but I just like what it does. I'm not traditionally a compressor user, so for me, if I'm gonna use a compressor, I want it to be like a standout, really squashed kind of thing. So this is an example where the the song starts with that sort of clean-ish sound and then drops into a big chorus-like intro where I'm doing the same part, but it needs to be louder. So basically what I'm doing is going to this setting, which is the same thing here. I'm just turning off the reverb and I'm turning on the preamp Mark II. And you can see how quickly, you know, that would have been 2 button presses, but here it's just 1 and I'm good to go. So. So that's basically my part. And then there's one section where Zach takes a big solo and I have to switch to his part. And I have to kind of mimic his guitar sound. So basically what that sounds like is going from this. So basically I'm going from all this stuff to just the Rat, and the Rat is mimicking his sound, which is this sort of mid-rangey, dark, distorted sort of rhythm guitar thing where he's just going. And then I'll go to a solo, which will be here. Something along those lines. Now you can tell there, like right now, that delay is kind of too loud for this sound. And that's a setting that I could pretty easily change, not by touching anything here on the Mastermind, but just by going to the 202, bringing the overall mix down, and then saving that to its slot. So that now whenever I go back to that setting, I don't have to think about it again. It's done. So that's the board. I hope you enjoyed this super long form walkthrough. I am so happy with this board. And the thing is, like what I showed you here really only kind of scratches the surface of what you can do with this combination of effects. The reality is I've only been playing with this thing for 4 or 5 days and programming my sounds. There's a lot here. There's a lot of options. There's a lot of stuff that, a lot of directions that you can go down with this combination of pedals. And like I said, there is this sort of weird crossover where, you know, a lot of these pedals will do their own version of the same things, primarily like the HX1, the 202, the Chroma console, and the Synesthesia. But they all do their own version of them, and being able to have those separate pedals handling different jobs at the same time, it just gives you plenty of flexibility. The last thing I want to touch on here is, you know, why did I go through this route then versus just going with a modeler, right? Arguably, a lot of what I showed you sound-wise, I could do with any of the big modelers these days, especially things like the Axe Effects or the Quad Cortex with a few pedals. And the reality is, I like this. I like this setup. I like amps. I'm going to use amps pretty much exclusively. The only time I would use a modeler in a live setting is when I absolutely have to. For example, when I've played with artists in the past and we've had to do like radio dates and perform inside of a radio studio, you can't use an amp there. So yeah, go DI, use a modeler. But for me, the type of guitar sounds that I like and the workflow that I like is a tube amp, an amp on stage, a pedal board in front of me. That's how I am. There's nothing wrong with going the other way, but if I need to, I can put a modeler on the floor next to this board, plug into it, and use it like an amp. But that's not something that I plan on doing. very often unless I absolutely have to. So you don't have to do this. It was expensive. It was time consuming. This is a very, very expensive and complicated rig. It's taken me a long time to get the sounds programmed and to learn the workflow. And there's still a few bugs that I have to work out. It's not perfect, but for me, this is exactly what I wanted. I spent a long, long time dreaming this rig up, thinking about what I wanted it to do in ways that it could inspire me, in ways that I could grow into it. And that's exactly what we did. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Once again, huge thanks to Barry and Eric over at XTS in Nashville, Exact Tone Solutions. I'll have all their information linked in the description box down below. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. I will try and get to them as they come up. Subscribe here to the second channel. This is for videos like this, the more long form things that don't necessarily make sense over on the main channel. And yeah, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for sticking around this long. You are a real nerd if you're watching this part of the video. I mean, damn, hats off. You're a real one. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. My name is Rhett Scholl, and I will catch you on the next one.